My name is Detective Clark, and this is my partner, Detective Jones. We're investigating the robbery at the mall this evening.
Step out of the car slowly, sir.
Deputy Travis Holtzer stood close to the window of the unmarked SUV, his shadow stretching long across the pavement as the patrol lights flashed behind him. His voice was sharp, undisguised, contemptuous. "All right, enough of the act. Both of you." His right hand hovered near the holster, the familiar posture of someone accustomed to others obeying orders before they even thought. When the man in the passenger seat slowly handed a card toward the window, holding it high enough to read, Holtzer glanced at it for less than a second before giving a dry laugh. "FBI agent? Just a shiny sticker bought online. Means nothing to me." He didn't ask any further questions, didn't request verification, didn't call the hotline. Instead, Holtzer leaned closer, his voice low but sharp and cold, carrying an undisguised threat. "I'm giving you two a chance. Turn off the engine. Open the door. Get out of the car right now." The atmosphere around the SUV became tense. The driver kept both hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, taking a slow, practiced breath. In the passenger seat, the other man held the card in place, not arguing, not backing down, just saying loud enough to confirm the identity was real, and asking Holtzer to give him 30 seconds to call his supervisor. That statement did nothing to calm the situation. It only irritated Holtzer more. He gave a wry smile, shook his head, and his gaze quickly swept to the back, where another man sat silently, his hands restrained, his eyes fixed on the floor. "My supervisor is asleep. I don't have time to wake him up for these kinds of games," Holtzer said, his voice rising as if to assert his authority. "If you don't cooperate, I'll tear this apart. Arrest, handcuffs, all of it." Those words echoed clearly in the darkness, picked up by the microphone on Holtzer's chest, by the dash cam of the patrol car, and by devices he didn't even notice. Holtzer stood there, convinced he was in control, that one more command would bring everything under control. He didn't know that at this very moment, every word, every gesture was being recorded, and that the people before him had the authority to turn this stop into the beginning of the collapse of a career he thought was untouchable. Travis Holtzer, 36 years old, had worn the Valencia County Sheriff's Office badge for 11 years, and during that time he had forged a very distinct reputation. Colleagues knew Holtzer was the kind of man who wouldn't back down once he suspected someone. The more challenged he was, the tighter his grip became. Holtzer's stops were often longer than necessary. His voice always high-pitched, his commands relentless, and rarely ended with a conciliatory explanation. His name had appeared a few times in internal reports, linked to complaints about his attitude and unnecessarily escalating tensions, but all had passed without any clear disciplinary action. That very silence nurtured a dangerous belief in Holtzer. He believed that if he acted tough long enough, the system would side with him. He believed that power didn't come from procedure or restraint, but from instilling fear and concessions in the other party. To Holtzer, backing down or calling a supervisor wasn't professional, but a sign of weakness. Each time a traffic stop ended without consequences, that belief was reinforced a little more, until it became a reflex. Tonight was no different. On the dark road, the red and green lights reflecting off the unmarked SUV, Holtzer entered the situation with a familiar mindset. He was in control, and everything before him had to follow his pace. He didn't see this as a routine inspection, but a test of power. And as always, Holtzer was certain he would emerge from this confrontation unscathed, completely unaware that years of neglected habits were leading him straight to a point of no return. Inside the SUV, no one raised their voice. No one made a single unnecessary movement. The driver was Rowan Calder, 42. An FBI agent with nearly 2 decades of experience in interstate transport and situations involving overlapping authority between agencies. For Calder, moments like these weren't about proving who was right or wrong, but about keeping things within the bounds of procedure. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers relaxed, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his voice steady and low, as it was during the most intense training sessions. In the passenger seat, 38-year-old Micah Lattimore, 12 years in the FBI, was assigned a task few wanted but everyone needed: handling communication when power clashes occurred. Lattimore didn't stare at Holtzer, nor did he turn away. He observed with peripheral vision, tracking every movement, every time Holtzer's hand approached and stopped at the holster. When he needed to speak, Lattimore chose his words carefully, avoiding argument or provocation, simply repeating what procedure required. In the back seat, the restrained man sat still, his back straight, his gaze lowered. Elias Kovacevic, in his mid-30s, a suspect cooperating with the federal government. The restraints were properly positioned, not too tight, just enough to ensure safety during transport. He said nothing, looked out the window, and did not react to the increasingly harsh tone of voice outside the window. This silence was not a challenge, but rather obedience to instructions. All three in the car understood something Holtzer didn't realize. Confrontations like this weren't won by volume or threats, but by patience and a record to be reviewed later. While Holtzer believed he was forcing the truth to surface, inside the SUV, every action was calculated with a single goal in mind: keeping the situation from veering off the line, even one step further. What truly caught Holtzer's attention wasn't the driver's calm voice or the properly presented identification card, but the scene in the back seat that didn't match his usual assumptions. A restrained man sat silently, unresponsive, offering no explanation. To Holtzer, this wasn't a sign of a legitimate procedure, but rather an unanswered question and a pretext to escalate the situation. He leaned toward the back door, pointing through the tinted glass, his voice sharp. "Who is he? Why is he tied up?" Calder replied curtly, without adding any unnecessary details. "Under legal supervision." That statement didn't reassure Holtzer. It irritated him. In Holtzer's mind, vague answers were a sign of concealment, and concealment meant it needed to be exposed. He took another half step toward the back door, his body obscuring the reflected light, making the SUV seem even closer to the curb. Holtzer didn't ask for transport documents, didn't inquire about the case number, and didn't ask if any federal agencies needed to be contacted. Instead, he issued a new, clearer, and firmer command: "Turn off the engine. Everyone get out of the vehicle." His voice was no longer a test, but an assertion of control. Inside the car, Calder let out a slow, deep sigh, then remained still. He reiterated his request to speak with his supervisor, not to argue, but to get the situation back on track. This request, instead of easing the tension, only made Holtzer clench his jaw even tighter. In his mind, being asked to call his superior wasn't a formality, but a direct challenge to the authority he believed he held. Absolutely. Holtzer didn't stop at that command. When he didn't get the desired response, he repeated the request in a louder voice, each word emphasized as if the weight of his tone could substitute for legitimate reason. "I said turn off the engine. Get out of the car. Now." In the same breath, he reversed the order, telling them to stay put, creating a cycle of contradictory commands that made any move potentially disobedient. Calder remained seated, his hands never leaving the steering wheel, his voice even and clear. He said they weren't refusing to cooperate, only requesting proper procedure and a supervisor present to clarify authority. From the passenger seat, Lattimore cautiously added, explaining that leaving sensitive documents and information out on the side of the road in a tense situation wasn't safe, and that calling a supervisor would protect all parties. Those words fell on deaf ears. Holtzer chuckled faintly, shaking his head as if he'd heard too many similar excuses. "Everyone says that," he replied, his gaze fixed on the back seat. He moved closer, tapping his fingers lightly on the window as if to emphasize that the decision had been made. In that moment, the stop was no longer about safety or verification, but about who would give in first. On the roadside, a few cars began to slow down, their headlights flashing in the rearview mirrors, reflecting Holtzer's stiff movements. The air was thick, each second dragging on longer than usual. Holtzer believed that with just one more push, the situation would fall apart the way he wanted, completely unaware that each contradictory command, each mockery of procedure, was adding another line to a record that could never be erased. Holtzer began making a series of mistakes, not because the situation suddenly became dangerous, but because he decided that his suspicions were more important than any procedure. He didn't re-register the vehicle with the dispatcher, even though it had already been flagged, didn't request additional forces in the proper sequence when he felt unsafe, and didn't record any specific reasons for the escalation. Instead, Holtzer chose to resort to coercion. He leaned low, his eyes level with the back of the car, and began the countdown. 5 seconds, Holtzer said, his voice icy. If the door doesn't open, I'll open it. The threat was clearly audible through the microphone mounted on his chest. From the passenger seat, Lattimore slowly raised the card higher, carefully holding it close to the window so Holtzer could see it without anyone making a further movement. It was a calculated gesture, just enough to show goodwill, yet avoiding any gesture that could be interpreted as defiance. Holtzer glanced at it again, without even reading the name. Fake, he said immediately, as if the conclusion had been made beforehand. I've seen these things before. Calder and Lattimore exchanged a quick glance, not of worry, but of the realization that this stop had crossed the line. Calder spoke up, stating his name, age, and clearly confirming that he was a federal agent, and asked Holtzer to stop escalating and call his supervisor. Instead of accepting the information, Holtzer moved closer, his voice low but defiant. "Do you think those words scare me?" he said. "You're in my territory." Behind him, the camera continued to record every movement, every choice. In front, in the SUV, no one raised their voice, no one made a superfluous movement. That very calmness, in Holtzer's eyes, was interpreted as stubbornness, and it pushed him one step closer to a decision he would later be unable to reverse. As Holtzer reached for the rear door handle, the tension in the car instantly heightened. It was no longer a verbal threat, but a clear indication of imminent interference in a process he hadn't yet verified. Lattimore spoke immediately, his voice still low but firm, warning that opening the door would constitute obstruction of an ongoing interstate transport. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't give orders, he simply stated the consequences in procedural language. Holtzer responded with a sarcastic smile. "Just wait and see what I do," he said, his fingers tightening on the handlebars. At that moment, the radio on Holtzer's shoulder suddenly blared. Dispatch asked if he could confirm that the SUV he was stopping was a federally registered vehicle. Holtzer paused briefly, for a single breath, then turned away as if he hadn't heard. "I don't care what dispatch thinks," he retorted loudly. "They're not going the same way as me." Instead of backing down, Holtzer chose to escalate the situation. He released his grip on the door, switched to the radio, and called for backup, his voice urgent and accusatory. "Send me another vehicle." Possibly impersonation, the subjects are uncooperative. Those words fell heavily in the air, labeling the people in the SUV before any verification was complete. Calder didn't react immediately. He remained in his position, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if understanding that any emotional reaction at this moment would only reinforce Holtzer's decision. Lattimore observed Holtzer's stance, noticing how he deliberately obscured the rearview mirror, narrowing the space around the car. It was a sign of someone trying to maintain control through body position, even as legal power began to slip from their grasp. The distant sound of car horns began to blare, then faded as passing vehicles realized something was amiss on the roadside. A pickup truck slowed down, the passenger raising a phone, the lens pointed directly at Holtzer and the SUV. Holtzer realized it almost instantly. His shoulders tensed, his chin lifted. His voice grew louder not to communicate, but to assert his authority before the watchful eyes. He ordered Lattimore to place his hands on the dashboard. Lattimore complied without hesitation, each movement slow and deliberate. "Don't move," Holtzer added, though there was no indication anyone intended to. Calder watched Holtzer through the mirror's reflection, noting each movement, each shift in position, realizing that he was maneuvering to keep himself between the SUV and the rear door, as if his very presence could prevent things from spiraling out of control. As Holtzer stepped back behind the driver's door, and then back forward, Calder spoke again, cautiously and slowly. He made it clear that the situation was escalating unnecessarily and reiterated his request to call a supervisor. Holtzer let out a dry laugh, a short, unfunny chuckle. "You talk about it as if it makes sense," he replied. In the distance, the sound of a second patrol car siren began to blare, faint but clear. Holtzer heard it. He straightened up, as if invigorated, and immediately grabbed the radio to confirm the location, repeating his version of events, using phrases like uncooperative and refusal of orders. On the side of the road, another person raised their phone. Everything was being recorded, and Holtzer, instead of lowering his voice, chose to raise his voice and tighten control, completely unaware that each new witness who appeared made the turning point a little narrower. When the second patrol car stopped a few dozen meters away, Holtzer glanced quickly over his shoulder and turned back immediately, as if unwilling to lose his central role for even a second. He gestured for his colleagues to stop, his voice firm. "I can handle this. Wait there." The second deputy hesitated, his eyes sweeping over the SUV, over the restrained man in the back seat, then back to Holtzer, clearly considering something. Calder remained motionless. He stared straight ahead, his voice low and calm as he spoke. "You're making a mistake." Not a threat, emotionless, just a cold statement. For a brief moment, Holtzer froze. His gaze wavered, glancing at the recording phones, at the second deputy watching, then back to the radio still slung over his shoulder. Lattimore seized the moment, adding a single sentence. He advised Holtzer to slow down, for his own good. This time, the words weren't merely formal, but a warning. Holtzer stiffened. "Are you threatening me?" he growled. Lattimore shook his head, his voice still. "No. I'm advising you." Holtzer turned abruptly, pressed the radio again, and asked the dispatcher to confirm the vehicle's federal registration, his voice clearly defiant. There was an unusually long silence on the other end. When the radio picked up again, the dispatcher's voice was different, slower and more cautious. They asked Holtzer to repeat the names of the people in the car. Holtzer took a breath, read each name, trying to keep his voice steady. The next silence lasted longer. In that silence, Holtzer stood still, his hands hanging down, his gaze no longer focused on the SUV as before. The second deputy stepped forward, close enough to hear every word exchanged. Then the dispatcher's voice rang out, clear and unquestionable. Rowan Calder and Micah Lattimore were confirmed as FBI agents. The vehicle belonged to a federal task force. Holtzer was ordered to end the stop immediately. Those words hung in the air. Holtzer didn't reply immediately. His jaw clenched, his face tense. In that moment, the power he had tried to maintain from the beginning began to crack. Not with a gunshot or a command, but with a cold confirmation emanating from the radio on his shoulder. Holtzer paused for another moment before pressing the radio button for a brief reply. Understood. His voice was flat and dry, a stark contrast to the previous harshness. Turning back towards the SUV, the change in attitude was undeniable. His shoulders slumped, creating distance where there had previously been only pressure and closeness. "Why didn't you make that clear from the start?" Holtzer asked, his voice lower, lacking the confidence it once possessed. Calder turned his head very slowly, his calm gaze fixed on Holtzer through the glass. "We told them," he replied. No further explanation was needed. That brief answer left a heavy silence. Holtzer glanced quickly at the cameramen, then at the second deputy, who remained silent, witnessing the entire turn of events. Calder didn't start the car immediately. He requested to see Holtzer's supervisor, his voice remaining calm throughout. Holtzer hesitated for a moment, then nodded, this time without argument. A few minutes later, another patrol car pulled up. Sergeant Linda Mora stepped out, radio pressed against her shoulder, her eyes quickly scanning the scene. Mora wasted no time. She asked Holtzer what had happened, then raised her hand to interrupt him when he began speaking rapidly. "I'll hear from everyone," she said, her voice firm and not raised. Calder stepped out of the car, as was customary, hand visible, and introduced himself again. Lattimore followed suit. Mora listened, nodded slightly, then turned to Holtzer with the single question that he couldn't answer immediately. Did you verify with dispatch before escalating? No excuses were quick enough. Maura turned back to Calder. "You're allowed to go," she said. "We'll handle the rest." As the SUV rolled back down the dark road, Holtzer stood on the side, his patrol lights still flashing. Realizing that the seemingly well-controlled stop had ended in a way he could not reverse, the transport continued in silence, the SUV quickly blending into the sparse traffic of the night. But for Travis Holtzer, it was only the beginning. Less than 48 hours later, he received notice of being placed on administrative leave. His badge and weapon temporarily surrendered while internal affairs collected all data related to the stop. Holtzer's body cam, the dash cams of the patrol cars, and videos recorded by bystanders were pieced together into a seamless sequence, leaving no room for subjective interpretation. When investigators reviewed the footage, the picture became clear and consistent. Orders were issued without basis, federal documents were dismissed without verification, and tension escalated gradually, not because of increased danger, but because of an unyielding ego. Holtzer was summoned for questioning. And then again, during those sessions, his account began to change. The order of events was reversed, the reasons were expressed differently, and small details no longer matched the images on the screen. Alongside the internal investigation, old, previously shelved complaint files were reopened. When juxtaposed with the new video footage, they no longer appeared as isolated incidents, but rather as links in a chain of the same pattern of behavior. A civil lawsuit was filed quietly, alleging unlawful detention and violations of civil rights. Holtzer was named personally. The professional union refused to provide full support. The sheriff's office began to distance itself publicly, calling what happened that night a personal decision, outside of policy. When the media got involved, clips from the video spread rapidly. The moment Holtzer smirked at the federal ID card and ignored the dispatch reminder became the iconic image of the incident. In closed-door meetings, internal emails were extracted, revealing warnings that had been issued but not followed through. There was no more debate about context or emotion. From this point on, everything revolved around one thing: evidence. And the evidence was not on Holtzer's side. The litigation didn't happen quickly, but it unfolded steadily, step by step, just like the system operates when everything is fully documented. Through months of filing, responding, and closed-door hearings, Travis Holtzer gradually disappeared from his role as a deputy and was left as an individual defending his own decisions. During the depositions, he sat in front of a screen, reviewing every moment of that night's journey, every word spoken, every step taken towards the SUV. No more teammates behind him, no more distance markers, only the repeated questions about why he escalated without verification and why he ignored the most basic procedural requirements. Before the case went to public trial, the county proposed a settlement. The negotiations lasted a day. At the end, the settlement included not only multi-million-dollar compensation, but also mandatory policy changes regarding how stop-and-run procedures and jurisdictional conflicts were handled. Holtzer was removed from all protections. That decision was deliberate. Shortly afterward, he received a termination notice. His badge was permanently revoked. His license was suspended and then completely withdrawn, with no appeal and no way back into the profession. Attempts to find other work quickly met an invisible wall of background checks. His name was tied to the incident, to the video, to the indelible recordings. Calls went unanswered. Old relationships faded into silence. Meanwhile, Rowan Calder and Micah Lattimore returned to work after only a few days, continuing their deliveries, as if that night were just another incident requiring proper procedure. The video of the car stop still exists. It's used in training sessions, in discussions about power and responsibility, as an example that needs no further commentary. It shows a simple but undeniable truth. Control isn't authority, and when procedure is disregarded, the camera speaks for itself. The stop lasted less than 20 minutes. Its consequences lasted for the rest of a career. If you find this story thought-provoking, please like and subscribe to continue following cases where the truth is told in its entirety, without exaggeration.